Pests beware, your fields have heroes. The Pests and Predators podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes and is powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Learn how beneficial insects fight pests and protect your crops. Visit fieldheroes.ca today.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
This is Ruminating with RealAg, and I'm your host, Amber Bell. For today's episode, I'm really excited to be speaking with Good-Hassard of Peak Heritage Consulting. Now, Anessa is a farm transition specialist, and we're going to be speaking about what is fair versus what is equal when it comes to transitioning the farm and what does succession planning look like. So just to give this topic a little bit of weight here, according to a 2021 Statistics Canada census, 75% of farms are going to be changing hands in the next 10 years. So I know our family farm is looking at that. It's a very relevant topic. So welcome, Anessa. It's wonderful to be speaking with you today.
Hi, Amber. Thank you so much for having me today.
So I'm really stoked for this conversation because we're going to be talking about what is fair, what is equal, and what does farm transition look like, because it's different for so many farms.
Absolutely.
So why don't you first give us a little bit of information about who you are, what you do, and why you're passionate about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So born and raised on our family farm north of Cochrane. So it's near Cremona, Alberta. So we're right on the cusp of the foothills. So we are hay country. And then I also grew up with purebred Semitals. And my husband, his family ranches in southern Alberta. But we have now moved back to my family farm here. So we are, I always say, living the succession journey alongside all of my clients. And I call it a roller coaster, right? Because as a family, we're buckled in and we're experiencing the highest of highs together, but we're also going to have some lows. That's family and life. And in regards to my consulting work, my father, Merle Good, has been in this space for his career and, just grew up at the kitchen table hearing stories of how he was helping family farms. And that to me was just such a cool opportunity of a job. And obviously when you grow up, you're not going to do what your dad did because, you got to forge your own path. But very quickly found myself coming back, joining my family's company, learning from him boots on the ground, and then had some other career opportunities, worked with Farm Credit Canada and had the privilege and the opportunity to work with families across Canada. So that was really interesting and exciting to learn in what ideas are across the country. And then, now as we slowly expand our small farm here at home, have went private and consulting with families to have that work-life balance. We'll talk about that word, Amber. Not sure if balance exists.
A lot, probably.
Yeah. But yeah, very, have been honored to sit at over 500 farm tables with families and hear their stories and work to help the family farm survive.
And it's really neat that you get to bring those stories forward to help new farm families, right? So when we talk about fair and equal, those are two very similar but very different words. So when it comes to succession planning, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's the sentence, right? Fair versus equal, that everyone talks about when they think of succession planning. It's interesting. We've kind of seen a shift in the industry. They're now using the term transition has become quite common for a while. And so my definition, just backing it up a little bit, Amber, is succession to me is the transfer of the business. So that means we have an actual business here that we are transitioning. Who of our family has chosen farming or ranching as their career? So who's stepping into that role? Estate planning to me is the transfer of assets while alive or on death through our will. And then to me, transition is a combination of both. And we're focusing on being proactive and not reactive. And so why I kind of start with that is then we can back up and say, when we're talking about fair versus equal, what are we talking about? Because everybody goes to the asset distribution, right?
Right.
And I like to back that bus up and say fair, and we'll talk about it today, I'm excited, is there's so much leading up to that asset distribution decision. that if we're just talking about what's fair for mom and dad's net worth to be divided, there's so many pieces that are up there. And we've all heard equal isn't fair, fair isn't equal. The only time in my consulting, even if a family is trying really hard to get that equal distribution, the only time we get even close is if everything's sold and the check's divided. And so that's what I like to remind families is, even if that's more of your goal versus a more fair distribution, which usually falls under the pillar of a farming or ranching child taking on more of the business and needing those businesses needing those assets for the business to be viable. It all comes down to opportunity. How do you define fair? In my consulting, I'll never tell parents what is fair. My job is to help guide them, work with a team of advisors, show, profit analysis, what's viable, sustainable, what's the tax implications of working with the team. But I just like to put that out there because I've heard of some families and spoken with them that have had advisors crunch, and said, this goes to this kid, this goes to that kid. And the parents are like, I'm just not comfortable with that. And it is mom and dad's ultimate decision.
Right. And I think that there's a little bit of stress on mom and dad's side of things on, okay,
Huge.
after I pass on, is this actually going to be acknowledged and followed? And, is my will actually going to be put into place, or is it all going to be fought over at the end of the day, right? And that's got to be difficult.
Yeah, that's a huge fear, right? Which is often why we see people not take action, right? Historically, is because there is so much fear. So when we talk about the will planning, the biggest thing I like to focus on is where I find people put their head in the sand a bit is they're trying to write the will that's going to be read when they're 99.
Right.
And there's way too much life to happen. There's grandbabies, there's marriages, there's figuring out the business. And so it's amazing, Amber, in my consulting, you see the shoulders come down when I'm sitting across from parents and I say, can you please put in writing the plan for the next 3 years? So if something happens, emergency, all the scary things, you'd be comfortable with the plan for the next 3 years. And then they will put pen to paper, right? The next thing is your business plan and your estate plan are dependent on each other.
Yeah.
It's so common sense, right? But we I feel historically have kind of operated in two silos of, well, this is my business plan and then here's my will. And so that's, as working with a team of advisors, when we sit down and say, okay, your fair versus equal planning, if farm assets are going to off-farm children, is your business still viable and sustainable? And then we have a bunch of concepts and strategies to help secure the access to that asset if it's going to a different direction. Meanwhile, the boomer generation, right, Amber, I call them builders because they just continue to build. If we're expanding or diversifying the business, that has to be reflected in the estate plan because, the operation can't go and buy out siblings if it's already in a tight debt position on this side. So that also helps with the 3-year mentality.
Right.
Because it tells us if your goal is to have a viable and sustainable business, what actually is feasible.
Well, and I guess that's something that the parents really have to look at too, because do they want the farm to continue on after? And, what
question
does that
number
look like?
one.
That is a big question. Have you seen, so how have you seen children's reactions be as the parents kind of work through this process? Because the parents get to make all the decisions, but it really does have a big impact, especially on kids that are working on the farm, on their future. So what have you seen the reactions come out of it?
100%. So that's why I originally got into this work because I would go and, sit at all these conferences and seminars and I love my dad dearly, but they all looked like my dad. They had gray hair and they were talking directly to the parents. And I was sitting in the back row waving my white flag like, hello, any decision you make greatly influences my family's future and opportunity. And so for the reactions, that's where, this whole, if we're proactive, if we're having these conversations, if we're doing all the things that we've heard a million times, we are transitioning ownership proactively. That is a part of it, right? So that not all the assets are left in the estate plan and the executor has to, decide if it's not a clear will and things like that. So obviously proactive transition ownership. Another piece to that children's reaction is, I call it the chicken will, which is I leave everything to my spouse, which kind of frustrates some people, right? And again, that's a definite age and stage conversation, but especially the senior generation, let alone the children's reactions. Are you comfortable, mom, for example, inheriting a large portion now of the company or land ownership? Is the farming child comfortable with that dynamic, or does mom want to be more of a creditor versus liable? And so these help with, I always say, we're so focused on transitioning down to the junior generation, but my job half the time is to get mom and dad in the same binder, not even the same page yet, right?
Right.
To get them aligned on these decisions. And then the conversations, the gift is if we're proactive with this, mom and dad can explain their why. Right?
And hopefully there's time for everyone to kind of settle into what that is. I have seen a couple families that end up with like, hey, they've passed on and no one even knows where the will is. And that's a disaster waiting to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so hopefully, I always say in succession planning, I always look at it as two lenses. So lens one is, exactly what we're talking about today, best practices for family and business viability is stages, and it's a transition, and we have goalposts in place, and it's this staged approach. But then there always has to be that second lens that says, if any key farm member passes away prematurely, what's our contingency plan? And so that's what, having those conversations and saying, okay, if the business is viable and sustainable, then more of the business assets are going to the business heir.
Right.
Okay. Now, the problem with succession planning, as we all know, is land values are the elephant in the room, no matter what province, right?
Yeah.
We're in. And so that's where then I have parents say to me, my biggest fear is when the farming child or ranching child, when in their line are they going to quit? Right?
And then what's done with that asset?
Because that line is going to be multi-millionaires. Meanwhile, my off-farm kids are trying to afford a house in an urban area. That's not fair. Right? So that's where in the States, like we're trying to figure out how can we mimic in the States. They have very different trust rules than us, very different. But in some of my work, starting to look at saying, okay, how do we stop fracturing the farm business for this fairness in estate planning and start to mimic a land capital partnership where instead of converting your equity to income, aka selling out, right?
Yeah.
It's more you're getting a return on kind of like cash rent kind of thing, but stopping to fracture the land base, because that's what we just keep doing. That's where it's very interesting in my work, with dairy and supply managed, when you can't cut a dairy barn in half. So their succession planning is very different than more of our traditional cow-calf grain, where we at least have the opportunity to say, okay, we may be able to use farm assets for distribution. So very interesting.
Well, and there has been this loss of, large scale pieces of farmland over the last, especially in the last like 20, 30 years. Like
Absolutely.
everything, one family transitions on and next thing you know, for a section is cut up into acreages. So that's for sure a problem. What are some of, let's say, the train wrecks that you've seen with it? Like sometimes we can learn from what was done badly. So what would be an example of that?
The biggest thing, I think, there's such a push right now in the industry for communication and all of this, and it's so important. Like it is none of this happens without, but I also think we have to grant each other grace and give credit. Like a lot of families I sit down with, they come in almost head down, and the shame because we don't communicate enough and we haven't wrote stuff down properly, but the foundation's there, right? So then it's just bringing in and saying, okay, let's just make this a little more formal. So a piece of that when it comes into fair versus equal, there's a couple of questions I ask mom and dad first. If senior generation still owns majority of the assets and they haven't yet brought in junior gen, first is how many generations are we planning for? Because a lot of times that's where these are the disaster stories where, they're already starting to plan for grandkids that haven't been born yet. And that's fine, but it's just having clarity on what we're planning for, right? Second one is heritage equity. So that's kind of the language I use. I like to put things in buckets. And so one of the disasters I've seen across couple families is junior generation's been home, really built up the business, and they feel they have earned the assets that they've contributed to that expansion. And yet, mom and dad, when they do their estate planning, have divided those assets amongst off-farm children. Mm-hmm. And so to me, I like to put assets in buckets and say, what is heritage equity before a child came back? Because that's the family, right? Like if you have 2 kids, 5 kids, 6 kids, that's the heritage bucket. And then we need to be very intentional and document, and not very many families do this, but those that are starting to, you just see it. It's quite magical. What is that quarter section that we're going after? What is that for? Our mom and dad saying, well, even if it's in a company, hypothetical, 50% is personal net worth that we're going to try to allocate, or is it to build the business so that it's going to follow the business? Mm-hmm. And the farm child is like, would you have even had the opportunity to buy that extra quarter if I hadn't come home with time, energy, brains, taking on risk, taking on debt, which is a huge part we have to remember in this fair versus equal, right? We're not coming home. It takes very unique personalities to step into ag business right now, right? Mm-hmm, that are willing to take on risk and debt. But I think that heritage equity bucket is a big one. Second of all, if senior generation is not willing to start, being open to these conversations, or everything is a secret and it's going to be a secret until they pass, it's a very difficult position to be in. But I do remind junior generation, you are choosing to put all your eggs in one basket. And you have to be then comfortable that you don't have control of where those eggs are going to go. And it's a very unfortunate place to be. But that, Amber, is when I cry driving home from a consulting meeting, and I'm sitting across from a 50-year-old couple, right? Kids already starting to be involved in the business. They just found out the farm or ranch is no longer viable and sustainable, and there's no plan B. That's the heartbreaking situation.
That is a really good point. And I think there is a lot of that where kids will come back to the farm and ranch, and they, make significant investments, and, maybe time, maybe financially, whatever, to improve and grow. And it can be hard too, because I think the other siblings sometimes are like, but it's dad and mom's, so that means it's ours.
100%.
I can definitely see where that struggle is.
Which is where documentation, right? Like, it's counterintuitive. Like, if you were to say, okay, these are the horror stories, but what's the best families? The best families. It's so counterintuitive because we're family. We trust each other, right? Mm-hmm. Which I'm not saying we don't at all, but it's why it's counterintuitive to say, actually, this is where we need to write everything down, document our reasoning. Corporations help a little bit in that sense, because you can actually see formally when the shareholder joined, right? That common share growth, how is it allocated? It makes it a little bit, but for sole proprietors or partnerships, maybe they aren't that formal. That's still saying, okay, we're going and purchasing that asset, and the intent of this asset is X. Mm-hmm. Starting to document. The other caution I have with that, which is where I differ from certainly some advisors in the industry, is I am cautious about the full transparency at different ages and stages. Some of the families I've worked on that has had the most emotional issues and siblings and things like that is when mom and dad opened the will at a very early age or stage and said, this quarter is going to Susie, this quarter is going to Billy. And then, 15, 20 years later, when the will was actually read, they had updated or revised the will, and they still got a quarter, Amber. Like, it's not like they were left out or anything, but it wasn't quarter A, it was now quarter B. and it was an explosion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I am very much a promoter of transparency of concepts.
Right.
So saying, okay, yes,
You will
farm
get
child,
a
you need to be
quarter.
aware land is going to off-farm children. You know, we're still sorting out, but you know, I am cautious of that full transparency, but at the same time, a lot of advisors fully believe in that, and I respect their expertise on that too.
Right. I do like the idea of making sure everything's written down and documented, because I think that there is a lot of, let's be real, when a parent passes on, that is a very emotional time. And nobody does well when it's an emotional time. You know, everybody gets heated. There's a lot happening. Even memories start to shift and change. So I really, really appreciate that. What
I love
happens like,
that point. Oh, sorry, just one
no,
little
no, that's
nugget there,
okay.
because I agree, like you're bang on. I agree so much. In this fair versus equal, especially, everybody talks about greed, right?
Mm-hmm,
As
mm-hmm.
a huge, again, personally, exactly what you were speaking to there. I focus a lot on grief. I
Right.
do think that everyone grieves very differently over a very different periods of time, and it now is being scientifically proven that grief does impact our cognitive ability, right? And we're not always just grieving the loss of a person, we're grieving the loss of an opportunity, we're grieving the loss of relationships. Like, grief is just so broad.
Right. Right.
And so
Even missed
again, if
opportunities.
exactly,
Like,
exactly, yeah.
mm-hmm.
So if we're being, not having a quote, I came up very early in my career. It's a little harsh, but I stand by it. Unspoken expectations are the silent killers of family farms. So we
I can
do
see
need
that.
to, articulate our expectations. Doesn't mean it's going to come true, but at least
Yeah.
it's on the board, and we can do our best to
And
make
people
those
know what to
happen.
expect then. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. And so what happens if, let's say you have one child that's working farming full time, others are working off the farm. How should the family start sorting that out? Like, what does that initial conversation look like without starting a big fight over it?
Yeah, 100%. Keyword, not starting. And again, that's where families that, start these conversations early, we've all heard it, right? It's not as much of a shock, and we don't have years of assumptions built up that if things aren't going to go the way that we're now trying to like pivot, right? So I like to use other examples of kind of, and then bring them in. So an example would be a prenup or a postnup. That's a protection mechanism that we sometimes talk about. If it's a family policy before we go out and find our partners, it's not personal to whoever we bring home, right?
Right.
So it's that same kind of conversation saying, okay, for the family members that are going to be on the farm, if we're talking cattle industry, which is my favorite and my heart industry, of course, we have to be realistic and talk about income, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge part of our succession planning. Yes, we've had, the highest gross income recently that we've had in decades, since, I'm not even going to say the three letters, but we have to be realistic and say, okay, there's so much labor that goes into our industry, which then brings up sweat equity, right?
That's a hard
Been
one.
around. Yeah, it's been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reason I bring that up is because, again, sometimes advisors will say, if you aren't earning a living wage or a very good wage, even in agriculture, they're starting to challenge that. Why are you coming home? Right?
Right.
How is this feasible? And especially, let's call a spade. In the cattle industry, that's probably not going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is then we come up with this sweat equity. So then the feelings of fairness between the off-farm child is saying, well, there's no way you've worked hard enough to earn the land value inflation as of late, right?
Right.
That can
Yeah.
easily be challenged if you were to put it on an hour. And so a formula that my dad created, but I've actually put my own spin on for sweat equity, is saying, what value is farm child bringing back to the business above and beyond labor? Because something off-farm children need to recognize, as well as farming and ranching children and spouses that are marrying into the business. Amber, you're talking with these experts all the time, and ranchers, how strong our managerial skills have to be, right? Like we just
Yep.
today to be able to, I think that's your competitive advantage going forward. And so that's where I like families to record you're above and beyond just a hired hand, right? My dad jokes he'd take a hired hand any day because the hired hand actually does what he says. And I'm going to be like, no, I want to do it this way, right? But that value formula is cash. So what you could afford to be compensated, plus cash equivalents. So those I kind of call perks. So are you getting less rent? Do you get to use the company truck? Do you get a beef, right? All these things.
Yeah.
And then the equity part is where we're actually starting to track that sweat equity. And this is also nice when we start to have some kids challenge. Well, I come home and help at every branding and every processing. Yeah. And it's like, that's wonderful. 3 days, right?
There's a
but it's that mentality.
Run. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we can still honor and value their contributions, but it's also very clear. And then we start to convert that equity to junior generation over time. But that sweat equity, I just like to really hammer that it's becoming easier to challenge the financial impact of that. But we all know that we still can't afford to pay you the $250,000 a year that you are worth if you're fully managing, I'm picking a number out of the sky.
Big rancher. Yeah.
Yeah. But even, when you start to get into, okay, if I'm taking courses and I'm doing all this, is it $100,000 a year I'm worth, but the farm still can't afford to pay me that? Or if I'm working off farm still, I love using this formula. So I'm taking no cash, but I'm building up my equity because I have off farm income, but that still needs to be recognized. Right.
So what does it look like? Because I'm thinking, okay, we do our accounting at least once a year. Hopefully people are tracking expenses and stuff more often than that. But let's be real, most farm families, it's in a box of receipts and you go through it once a year, right? So
they just magically disappear from the truck console. I don't know where they went.
They go somewhere. So what does it actually look like? Like how often would you recommend people be keeping record of that sweat equity? What does that actually look like? Or is that just, hey, at the end of the day, when we finally sit down to the table together, we talk about this?
So again, that formula, value equals cash plus perks plus equity. I kind of call it, get ready because you're going to rip off a Band-Aid. And when you rip off a Band-Aid, there's going to be blood, but it'll eventually scab, right? Because this is really an opportunity, especially between the active business participants, so parents and the active children or siblings or, that are in the business. Do we feel that we've been fairly compensated or valued to date? Because we're always so worried about what off-farm kids feel, but we're trying to make sure we don't have resentment brewing between the active business participants too, right? And so that equity formula, I like tracked, if you are using it monthly, it's just part of and then we have our tally at the end of the year, and then we talk about, do we build up that equity and then every 3 years get more shares in the company or something like that? And time value of money. I've waited for my entrance into the company and the pattern. So does that mean that it's doubled 1.5, 2 times? Because again, we have oodles and oodles of equity, right? And so best practice would be consistently checking in. That perks conversation, some families choose not to count it as part of a compensation package, but I still think it's so important to be tracked at least minimum annually. Because it's so much insight for the spouses too, right? The child themselves. When I first moved back to join my family's consulting company, what mom and dad told me they could pay me, I was like, I'm going to be in an itchy van until I die, right? Like that's reality. And this is where this kind of started, is my dad sat down with me and said, what are all the perks? And when we went through, I was making more than I was downtown Calgary oil and gas, but it just wasn't reflected in my checking account. Right. Recognition and appreciation on family farms and ranches are so important because it also helps sometimes if I'm with an entitled farm child to say, hey, you are taking home $70,000 a year,
Yeah.
which is still an okay wage in some farms, plus $60,000 a year of perks, that's got to be kind of accounted for. And then the gift is that as we start to take over the business, this is the beauty of a family run business. Mom and dad, when you're no longer active in the business and participating, we're still going to not charge you rent to live on your house. We're going to pay your utilities. You still get to use purple gas. And that's the beauty of the pass off, right?
Right. And I think that's something that's not really spoken about a whole lot either, is that when a farm transitions, while the parents are still alive, there are still perks that the parents can gain out of that farm.
100%. Aside from the mental, right, perks of,
Being out on
again,
land
I differ. Yeah, 100%, Amber. Like, I differ from some advisors that I'm like, if you want to die with your boots on, that's my goal. Like, that's amazing. I'm not asking you to go golf, right?
Right.
But that has to be respected of letting junior generation step in, start making managerial decisions, having ownership, blah, blah, blah. But retirement income is where I start, actually, on fair versus equal.
Mm-hmm.
So I say before we can start about gifting equity or dividing equity, mom and dad, I need to know that you are financially secure today and until the day you die. Cost of care is rising exponentially.
Oh yeah.
So, right, how is that starting to come into play? Where is that income coming from? Because we all know there's usually not large investment portfolios and things like that because every dollar went back into the farm.
Mm-hmm.
So to your comment about perks being on the farm, I often say to mom and dad, fill out your cost of living. Haven't had a family yet that could tell me their cost of living. So I love that exercise to start for every generation. Fill it out twice because they come, Amber, and they like puff out their chest and they're like, I live off $50,000 a year. And I'm like, no, you don't.
Do you?
Yeah, right. Like the farm is paying your utilities. The farm's paying your vehicle, the farm. So that's why it's such a beautiful exercise to do twice. Yeah, 100%. That's why it's such a beautiful exercise to do twice. And I say, pretend you lived in town in case for health reasons you had to move to town prematurely. Our succession plan is taking that into consideration because again, when you said, what are some train wrecks you've seen? I think we all can look in our community and say, mom and dad did everything right. They proactively transitioned. They started though to get tight because of cost of living, right? On what their bucket of money was that they had from selling the farm to junior gen or whatever. Who did they go back to? They go back to the farm child or the ranch child to say subsidize, not necessarily the off-farm children. Right?
That's very true.
So that's where I'm very passionate about mom and dad's income first, and then we can go down. Just another comment on that, starting to challenge. It's just my job to ask questions, right? So why does an off-farm child get to inherit a quarter of land, for example, free and clear?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's where we're starting to say, I kind of call it like a TFSA concept. So some families I've been working with, they're looking at options to say, okay, if junior generation contributed to a quarter of land that they are going to inherit versus a TFSA, so it's that same mentality. It's not charity to mom and dad.
No.
Because they're still inheriting, in our area, $1 million quarter, right? That if we did the time value of money, I just did it on the whiteboard the other day with rough cowboy math, it was a 500% return on paying $12,000 a year between the husband and wife, right? But $12,000 a year times 3 off-farm kids, that made up a huge chunk of mom and dad's retirement income that the business didn't have to fund.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So quickly, let's just touch on that because I think that there are a lot of ranch families, a lot of farm families that, let's be real, it's really hard when you live on the land, you work the land, to separate business versus personal. And I mean, even when we do our accounting, like the reality is our accounting is, it's like this, it's meshed super tight, right? So how important is it that we almost try, like you mentioned, okay, do your expenses as though you were living in town. How important is that we do that before we even like go to the table knowing the difference between our business income versus like, hey, these are our personal expenses and this is business expenses, business income.
Yeah, and I think that's why, working with advisors, right? Like it's not just me. Like we've evolved, because we have to remember the size and scale and complexity of the businesses we're running today. Even, a half section, there's still a lot of balls in the air and, things like that. Versus, of course, we have large farms and ranches and things like that. It's scaled proportionally for complexity. But having a team. So that's where I'm really passionate about, is that traditionally, potentially, it was more of a focus on we need our accountant and our lawyer, and that's how we're best going to transition the assets for the best tax plan. And our accountant is going to draw that up in a very valid will, an estate plan. Mm-hmm. We've now progressed to saying the team is advisors such as myself and other advisors out there that look at more of the holistic plan and don't specialize in one specific area, but say, okay, family, business, ownership. It's a very common 3-circle model in family-run businesses. We're looking at all 3 of those and saying, how do they push and pull? And exactly like you said, starting to help put things in buckets. Because exactly as you said, Amber, when a family looks at their operation, I didn't say business because that gets into the business versus lifestyle, right? Like all these things. It's the farm. It's the ranch. Mm-hmm. And so that's where advisors, we can help and say, okay, this is the business assets. So our debt, our inventory, our equipment. The next bucket I like to do is our estate planning buckets. So on a ranch, our personal wealth bubble is going to be ginormous. Why? What assets in there?
Land.
Right? Absolutely. And then if it's a cow-calf operation, like 99% of them out there are off-farm investment bubbles this big, right? Because everything's went back into the business. So then we start life insurance, TFS, like just getting a very clear cut of where are we at today.
Right.
Then we can start to say, where do we want to go? But often a lot of my work is figuring out, is the equipment owned by junior generation and senior generation? Is it half owned by the company and half owned by son and wife's partnership? Like there's so much to just figure out the business piece first. And then we'll start talking about what it can look like in the future.
Right. And let's speak about the marriage piece, because I think that is something that I could foresee causing a lot of problems, right? On one side of things, let's say a husband or wife comes onto a family farm. They don't want to necessarily make a whole lot of investments into something that they could lose in the case of, heaven forbid, divorce or, right? But at the same time, the family also doesn't want to end up losing a chunk of land because, well, my son or daughter got divorced. So what does that conversation look like around the table?
Everybody's looking for security, right? So that, I think, yes, sorry, I'm going to squirrel here a little bit, but everybody's looking for security. But I think it's very important to remember that every single farming or ranch family is the succession effect. So junior generation is like, let's go. We have time. We need time in agriculture to borrow. We have energy. We have passion. Let's go. Meanwhile, senior generation is like, I need to have security for this next phase of my life. And so it's like we're hitting each other, right? On goals and objectives. So that kind of plays into that piece. The next piece, like you said, of security of if there's a divorce, right? Or if senior generation, if I put a lot of investment in as junior generation and then senior generation is going to give it away to someone else. And so the divorce piece, it's one of the biggest hurdles that I work on in my consulting. Because that's what's stopping parents, I find a lot of time, from putting pen to paper, is what if they get divorced, right? And it's a very valid and fair. What I think we have to be careful of, and again, this is my stance, doesn't mean it's, but I'm very passionate about making sure we don't turn in-laws into outlaws unintentionally through this process. And I do feel, for best business practices, we need all these documents and agreements, and I agree with them and I work on those agreements and they're fantastic, but we have to make sure how we're approaching the conversation and the intent of the documentation doesn't accidentally make that in-law feel like targeted. So then they do start to protect themselves and become an outlaw, right? So who's on your team of advisors to help support through this process? I've had a number of clients reach out to me because they didn't feel that this was an issue when they started the conversations. And then they sat across from a technical advisor who had the right intention to protect the business, but went after the in-law. So now the in-law felt very, right, rocky and not good. And so we have to back up. So a big thing is mindset, Amber, in my opinion. So it used to be control, right? Senior generation, my father, big advocate. How do I control this? Can I control from the grave? All these pieces. I really like the mindset shift of protect. It just changes, right? So I haven't met a family yet that said we don't want to protect mom and dad because they worked so hard and this is their legacy. We want to protect all of our children through this process, and we want to protect our land, our legacy, and our stewardship.
Right.
So when we approach it from that, that's where we can say, okay, is a prenup or a postnup document a tool? But what's changed is they used to have whenever I talk about them and my clients, they all say the same thing. Well, isn't the prenup supposed to screw the spouse? Like, it's supposed to screw over the spouse. Like, it's just to protect the ranch. And luckily, that has changed in the industry. So it's also to protect him or her, the in-law. So you have to have independent legal advice. So a separate lawyer representing that individual has to review it to make sure that they're not signing something that, is misunderstood or something like that. And so I went through it with my husband. I learned a lot going through it. And the biggest thing I took from that was when his lawyer said, that's the most fair agreement, I've ever seen. And I was like, oh, right? Like, that's the point. We're still protecting our land base. If him and I get divorced, my parents' equity is protected, but we were also protecting him, right?
At the same time. Yeah. I think that's very important. And so what does that look like if a family, because a lot of families are, they're worried about bringing in outside help, whether that's like protection of information. We see a lot of that. What does it look like if farm families try to have these conversations without an advisor in the room or without extra help?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work that you guys are going to have to do on your own regardless. So I think that's one of the first, I don't know if misconceptions is the right word, but I kind of hear is they're like, we still want autonomy, we still want, and I'm like, there's a lot here that you still have to decide. Like, no one is going to hold your hand through this entire process. So that I would say is like one of the first. Often as advisors, some of the feedback I hear is, well, I went to my accountant or my lawyer and said, what should we do? And the technical advisor said, well, what do you want to do? And then the farmer and rancher is super frustrated, right? And I'm like, okay, that's a good thing though, because you still have to have an idea of what you want, right? Going back to our original, do you want a viable and sustainable business? Things like that. So that autonomy is still there. If you bring in a third-party team member, you don't know what you don't know, right? You cannot be an expert at every single thing. There's people that are so much further ahead than me than herd health and things like that aren't vets, but are just so much more as producers competent than I am. I love calling them, leaning on them, as well as my veterinarian advice. Like, we can't know all the things and keep up. So that's a big one. And then because this topic is so personal, it's very hard to look at, like you said earlier, Amber, objectively, right? So even my own family, I do this for my career. My father and mom had their consulting business, did it for their career. We still bring in third parties a lot because we can't see the forest through the trees.
Right. And I think it's important too to remember that one expert is an expert in one area, right? So you bring in your accountant. Well, your accountant isn't a lawyer and your lawyer isn't an accountant.
Absolutely.
And so you really need that team, that combination.
Who's your financial planner that's taking into account that retirement income conversation. So they're going to run the tools through and say, $100,000 a year in 2025 is, I don't even know, 115,000 10 years from now, right? Like they're going to account. So it takes such a team, and that's the real mindset shift for succession planning.
Right. Can you share a story where you saw a family really get it right? Like maybe not perfectly, but good enough that the farm, the family, everybody kind of was in a good place at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's so many success stories, right? Like we all hear the horror stories or look in our own community. But that's the exciting part, is if we do slow down and take a look even around our own community, there is so many success stories, right? So to me, families that get it right are really taking, if we're proactive, it's not personal. If we wait to react to a person, situation, or thing, now it's personal.
Right.
And so when it's personal, now our family dynamics are severely impacted, right? Families that are getting it right. My favorite quote in consulting is, "Perception is reality, facts are negotiable."
I like that.
Yeah, so everyone's like, well, it's black and white, right? Like it is or it isn't. It's like everyone's going to have a different perception. And so why I bring that up is my next families that get it right do a lot of analysis with math. I love math. Math helps alleviate emotion, but it does not remove emotion.
Right.
And I find a lot of people expect it, especially if they're an analytical, right? Well, this is the only way it's viable, so this has to be done. But someone that maybe isn't as analytical doesn't see it that way, right? So families that can defend or back up or reason or explain their decisions get it right. So math helps with that. Documentation, here's the plan. You can handwrite letters that your lawyer reviews to make sure you're not accidentally contradicting anything in your will. But that's a piece of this too, that the darker side of this planning is, a will could be the last time you speak to your child.
That's true. That's a good point.
Right? It's very, like, when you hear that, makes
like,
some
ooh,
people
ouch.
freeze.
Yeah.
But that's where I love a handwritten letter
Yeah.
to accompany the why, right?
That's great. Yeah.
And we focused a lot, Amber, and I just want to make sure that this little nugget's in there, you know, of parents, because it's under the assumption that they own the majority of the assets in this conversation. I am terrified in my consulting how high the percentages of junior generation not having a will.
That is a really good point too. There's
So
a
I'm
lot
like,
that
we
don't.
can't point fingers at mom and dad and say, what's the plan, if we're not showing up like a competent business partner. So it scares me in the sense that often there's already some assets been transferred that I'm like, where is this going? Where's this land? Where's these cattle? Where's these shares? But the one that of course I hammer is the grandchildren. Like that. How many of them are not protected under an up-to-date valid will? I think is something our industry needs to really remember.
And I think that that word protection really comes into play with that, right? Because you don't want it to just end with like our generation
100%.
either. So, and I'm pretty sure most of our parents don't want it to end with our generation. Like they want to see that go further. And in order for that to happen, we need to be planning as well as, you know, our parents.
Yeah.
And
that's the business side and the ranch and things. But, you know, I'm coming, just stripping all that away and saying, no, family, like, where are these children going? You know, if their parents pass away in a car accident at the same time, like, do not leave it to the Court of Canada to dictate the well-being of the most important asset on the farm or ranch, which is our individual family members.
That's right? A really good point. And okay, so just before we wrap up here, if you could tell every farm family in Canada one thing about fair isn't always equal, one thing you wish that they would hear before it's too late, what would that be?
A lot of pressure, one thing. My brain's like ticking
You're
through
like,
all the
so
things.
many things.
I think proactive, sitting down and understanding that we only have to write a will that's in place for the next year, the next 3 years at a time, having that documented, and then working with technical advisors to say, okay, to ensure if the goal is to have a viable and sustainable business continue, there is a lot of unique ways to do that while still acknowledging and being fair to our off-farm children and ensuring that they're respected and have an inheritance as well.
Right. Right. Well, it's great work that you do. How can people contact you if they are looking for some help with some transitioning?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is peakheritageconsulting.com. I have a free resource on there on compensation, which I think all ties into this fair versus equal very well. And lots of articles and videos and things like that. My email is peak, as in mountain peak, heritageconsulting@outlook.com.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And that was Anessa Good on Real Agriculture.